All right, everyone. So in the last example or last video, we kind of showed examples of rectangular and elliptical marquee tools to help select things. Now, of course, that's great when everything is a circle or a square. But what if you have something that's a little bit more unique, something a little more organic or something like that? So we have additional tools that can help us. So we're going to go through some of these additional tools. Now, the first set of tools we're going to talk about today are what we refer to as lasso tools. And with the lasso tools, like it sounds like the idea here is that we are going to, if you don't know what a lasso is, let me explain. If you ever watch like an old Western or something, a lasso, there are people who use lassos these days, although it's more rare. A lasso is a piece of rope that goes out and it comes back to itself, forms kind of like a slip knot. Okay. And then you do that little thing, throw it over the cow or the horse, the thing that you're trying to capture, and then it kind of like tightens. Okay. So the point about a lasso is lassos only work because you know, it has to come back to itself. Otherwise, it's basically, if it doesn't come back to itself, it would be not very useful as a piece of rope. Okay. So what we can do here, the lasso is a tool that allows you to go out, draw your own selection as long as as long as the selection comes back to its origin point. So I'm going to grab the basic lasso here. I'm just going to zoom in a little bit. Now I'm going to go fast for the sake of this demo, but you should spend a little bit more time than I'm doing. I'm just going to click and kind of drag around. And you can see I'm getting this unique kind of shape here. You might want to use like the zoom in and the pan tools to kind of move around your scene as I'm doing right now. I'm going to zoom out once again for the sake of this, lab not taking forever. But I'm just going to go around this shape in an organic way. I'm going to go back to the origin here, and you can see that I get my own custom shape. I'm going to use the move tool just like we would use before. Okay. Now, like with the marquee tools, I can use feathering. So for instance, if I were to turn on feather or set a feather here, you can see that, that is a feathered piece here. I'm going to turn off feathering to 0. Like with marquee, right now this is set to replace. So every time I draw a new lasso, it replaces the old lasso selection. I could use the add just like we did before, in which case when I draw in a complete lasso shape, it would add to my current selection. Or I could use the subtract here to subtract whatever I'm drawing as my lasso from the current selection. All right. Bibbidi bobbidi boom. Um, I wanted to also kind of point out that, I'm going to click and drag. And like I said, the point of a lasso is it returns back to its origin point. So my origin point, starting place is at the lower left here. And what I'm going to do is I'm at the top right here. I can't let go of my mouse, otherwise it's going to automatically do it. But if I were to let go, it's going to go from my last point, which is at the top right, to the opening point, which is at the bottom left, in the shortest distance possible. Shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line, and you can see it cuts right through my object. Okay. So this is a good way to, create your own unique shape. Now, part of the problem with this is, it's all based on your hand movement. And if you don't really have surgical like hands, it might be a little difficult for you. So there's additional lassos that we can kind of play around with. Next is something called, if I click and hold, there's this option here called the polygonal lasso. Polygonal means that I'm making a shape. Okay, so in other words, what you can do is we are going to lay out something called an anchor. The anchor are the points between a segment or a line. So if I make an anchor 1 and I make an anchor 2, what's going to happen is it's going to draw a side like that. If I make an anchor 3 and 4 and 5, so this is, 3, 4, 5. I start to make a shape. And the idea is that you can build sort of this linear shape. And if you return back to the origin, the shape that you create becomes a selection. Let's try that out. So I'm going to grab this and I'm going to click right here at the bottom left. And that's my first anchor. You can't see it, but it is there. And then I'm going to kind of click over here. So I made my first anchor, my second, and then there's a segment between it or a line. Then I'm going to click there and there and there and there all the way through. Now, if you make a mistake, like I'm doing deliberately here, the way you can fix that mistake is by hitting the delete key. The delete key would remove previous anchor points. All right, so I'm going around. So I don't know if I can, if this will come through in the video, because I don't think when I blow up my video on a recorder, it actually works that way. But I'm blowing it up, and you might be able to see that little circle at the bottom right-hand corner. What that means is I'm completing my shape or my selection. So if I click, I now have a selection that I can click and move as such. Like with the others, there is the option to do feathering. So if I did like 10 pixels, you can see I have feathered edges here. You can also do things like adding and subtracting. So if I use the subtraction method here, okay, oops, I should have taken off the feathering, but that's a separate issue. You can see how I have, kind of removed the inside part here. Okay. All right. So I'm gonna delete. I didn't mean to do that. Sorry about that. I mentioned, this is a lasso. And so what this means is that the lasso has to return back to its origin. Now, my origin point is here. My last point, at least at the moment, is here. If I wanted to go from my last point back to my origin point, the easiest way to do that is by hitting the enter or the return key. And that's going to go from my last point back to my origin point in the shortest distance possible. Shortest distance possible between 2 points is a straight line, and you can see it cuts through. Okay. You can kind of use this to your advantage if for some reason, you're going around your character as such, and you just can't seem to, get the ending here. You could just hit the return key or the enter key, and that would close off your shape as such. All right. All right, the final lasso tool I want to talk about is called the magnetic lasso tool. And to understand it, we have to understand a little bit about the concept of contrast. Okay. So in the case of the magnetic lasso tool, we're going to talk about this idea known as luminance. Luminance is how bright or how much light or lack of light is in a photograph. Now, I'm using black and white images because I think it's easier to understand this concept when you put things in black and white, literally. But this could actually be colored photos too, and it wouldn't change anything that I'm discussing. So when you have a photograph, you have light sources. That light source may literally be the sun, or it could be like a lamp or a spotlight of some sort. And so where the light source is bouncing off, that is the bright areas. Okay. In a black and white image, the areas that are very light, like this or this or this, these are where the sun or the light source is bouncing off, and that would be the highlights. The opposite of that would be where the light source does not bounce off of, like here or here or here. That would be considered like the shadows, okay? A lack of light is hitting that. And then everything in between is kind of what we refer to as the midtones. So if I were to look at this, it's like, okay, there's highlights here, there's highlights on the wall, there's some highlights in the shoulders and the arms and that sort of thing. A lot of times in real life with photography, a lot of highlights come from above. Or so like here, it's like, and that's because most light sources are usually coming down, like the sun or even lights, like you can see behind me, there's lights in my ceiling that come down. So usually the highlights for humans are like on the top, especially if you have kind of an oily head like I got. I should, touch that up. I also have bald, so there's no hair. Skin tends to reflect a little bit because of oils that are there. You can also notice that there's like some highlights. Oops. Sorry about that. There's some highlights in the sorry, I'm not used to using this program. I apologize. There's some highlights here in the nose. You can kind of see it here, and that's because the sunlight, the light source is coming down, typically like in the shoulders, things like that. The opposite is usually for humans, like the places that are the darkest are usually on the underneath because, once again, the light source is usually coming down. So it's like you can see here the neck, underneath the nose, underneath the ridge of the eyes, that kind of stuff. In the armpits and whatnot are usually the shadows. Okay. And everything else is kind of in between. Once again, like highlights, shadows, okay, shadows underneath, that sort of stuff. Um, so what does luminance have anything to do with selecting anything? So I want to talk about the idea of contrast. Contrast is when the foreground of an object is easily separated, or you can easily tell the difference between a foreground and a background. Okay. So here I have high contrast. It's very easy to see where the text exists and the white background um, begins. Here, it's a little bit different. You can even kind of do this mathematically. The way that luminance is usually measured in Photoshop is it goes from a scale of 0 to 255. If you're wondering why 255, it's when you add one notch of 0 to 255 notches, that's 256, and that's a power of 2. Computers are binary, so that's a pretty common thing. And 0 is essentially means pure darkness, no lack of light, and 255 is a pure light. Okay. So if you have black on white, the range of the darkest to the lightest is about 255 variations of luminance. Whereas here, I don't know exactly what this is in terms of the gray, but let's just hypothetically say it's kind of like I have a white background with maybe like an off gray here. I'll just make up a number. It's like, 190 or something. So 255 minus 190, or there's like 65 variations of luminance. So when there's a less number of less variance of lumens, you're going to have lower contrast. Okay. Now, what does any of this have to do with selecting? Well, when you have an image, okay, we want to I want to select the foreground character here. And it's important that the foreground character stand out against the background, okay? Don't worry about what I'm doing, but I'm just going to like literally turn this into a black and white image. And it's like, it's very easy to see where I mean, I don't know exactly what this is, but it's like these are darker gray versus a higher white. So if I was looking at this, it's like, I don't know what happened to my, it's like, it may not be as dark or as high contrast as this, but it's like on my luminance level, it's like you got 255 at the brightest and maybe like, I don't know, like 50 or 75. So there's like 150 luminance values, blah, blah, blah. So this actually has pretty good contrast. Okay. So what I'm going to do is take this magnetic lasso tool. And I'm just going to kind of click it on the edge here. I'm just going to kind of drag it along the contours. And when you do that, you can see it like snaps to the edges, snaps to it like a magnet might, if you will. So as I drag, you remember how we made anchors in that previous exercise 4? It's the same idea. It's actually, they're also anchors. In fact, if you were to, oops, I didn't mean to do that. I didn't mean to close it like that. Let me just go real quick for the sake of this demo not taking forever. Not my best work, I'm just not going to lie. But anyway, if I make some mistakes like that, I can hit the delete or the backspace key to move backwards. Okay. I'm just going to go around the whole thing. And so, this magnetic tool allows for more organic, selections where things are not a perfect circle. Unfortunately, with things like the lasso tool, it's very hard if your hand's not, masterfully steady, or the polygonal is very good for very linear things like boxes and buildings, but maybe not as good for, organic things like hair or fur or something like that. I'm gonna go around and I'm gonna go, once you see the little circle on the bottom left, sorry, bottom right, that means I've gone around my whole item. And then boom, okay. In your options here, this is how often it's gonna add anchors for you. This is how far away you're allowed to be from the contrast, the contrast edge. So if I actually make this a higher amount, I can actually even see how like I'm actually, here, let me zoom in a little bit there. See how like I can actually be, oops, of course now it doesn't do it, but see how like I can actually be a couple of pixels from the edge and it still is doing all that for me. So it means how far you can kind of be without, to go around your object. Like with the polygonal, let's say I wanted to close my shape. What I'm going to do is, like with the polygonal, if you were to hit the return or the enter key, what that would do is go from your last point to uh, your opening point in the shortest distance possible, which, as we know, is a straight line. So if I hit return, it's going to cut through that. Okay. Um, so yeah, those are some good examples of using different lasso tools to be able to make selections. All right. Why don't you guys try that out? That was 3, 4, and 5 in the Photoshop section of today's files. Okay. Or sorry, just open these into Photoshop and be able to work with 3, 4, and 5.